Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're looking at one of the most dangerous intersections in history, that precise moment where absolute, unshakable faith crashes headfirst into cold, hard logic.
Right.
And we aren't just talking about some dusty history lesson here. This is really about the ultimate battle for the mind.
It really is. And the core question is, well, it's terrifyingly simple.
Can you use reason to find God, or does thinking too deeply, does that inevitably lead you to atheism?
That is the cliff edge we're walking today. We're looking at the 12th century philosopher Ibn Rushd Averroes in the West and his desperate defense against the charge of heresy.
Yeah, and it's a story about a specific divide he created between the, let's call it the simple believer, and the intellectual elite.
A divide that basically asks, can the masses actually handle the truth about God?
Exactly. So we're diving into a translation of his work, The Harmony of Religion and Philosophy, and we've also got some really biting commentary from Who's in Portugal to guide us.
But before we even get to Ibn Rushd, our hero, we have to understand the villain of the story, or at least the antagonist.
Right. To understand Ibn Rushd, you first have to get your head around the man who basically put a bounty on philosophy a generation earlier.
Al-Ghazali.
A real heavyweight.
Oh, the ultimate heavyweight. Al-Ghazali wrote a book with maybe the most devastating title in the history of theology.
Which was?
The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Wow. That is the mic drop title. He's not just saying they're wrong, he's saying they don't even make sense.
And the content was just as lethal. Al-Ghazali argued that philosophy wasn't some harmless hobby. He said it was a direct path to kufr.
To unbelief, to atheism.
Exactly. He specifically accused philosophers of three things: believing the world is eternal, denying God knows the details of our lives, and denying the physical resurrection.
So he's saying if you follow logic to its conclusion, you lose God.
That was the charge. So the atmosphere in the 12th century is it's toxic. If you're a philosopher, you're basically seen as a secret atheist trying to dismantle religion from the inside.
And into this mess steps Ibn Rushd.
And he's not an outsider. That's the key thing to remember. Ibn Rushd is a qadi, a judge, and a grand religious scholar.
So he's trying to defend logic while wearing the robes of a theologian.
Which is an incredibly dangerous tightrope to walk.
Before we see how he tries to pull this off and whether he succeeds or just gets pushed off the rope, I want to take a quick second.
Sure.
If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
It certainly does. Okay, so Ibn Rushd is in the hot seat. The source material mentions a specific incident that shows just how real this danger was. He was actually exiled.
To a place called Lucina.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for some political crime. You could say it was for doing a weather report.
A weather report?
Essentially, yes. It's the story of the Ad people. The Quran tells this story, an ancient tribe, the people of Ad, who were destroyed by a furious, divinely sent wind because of their sins.
A classic divine punishment story, I know it.
Right. But Ibn Rushd is a rationalist. So he looks at this and he tries to explain it scientifically. He questions the literal existence of the tribe, or he tries to explain that the wind was a natural phenomenon.
Caused by atmospheric pressure, not just God getting angry.
Exactly. And the public did not like that one bit.
I can imagine.
The source mentions that when a storm was coming, the locals were terrified. I mean, they were digging holes, hiding in mazes, thinking God was sending a wind to wipe them out.
And here comes Ibn Rushd saying, actually, it's just a low-pressure system.
And by trying to explain the mechanism, he removed the fear. And to the people, if you remove the fear of God's direct wrath, well, you're denying the Quran. You're an atheist.
So he gets exiled.
Yeah.
But he doesn't stop. In his book, The Harmony of Religion and Philosophy, he fights back.
He does. He makes this incredibly bold claim. He says the religious law, the Sharia, doesn't just allow philosophy.
It commands it.
It commands it. It's his best legal argument. He quotes the Quranic verse, reflect you who have vision.
And he breaks that down like a lawyer.
He does. He asks, what does it mean to reflect? It means to think. But specifically, it means to use logic, to deduce the unknown from the known.
The definition of a syllogism.
Right. So he argues, if God commands us to reflect, then God is legally obligating us to use logic and philosophy.
I love the analogy he uses here, the one about the craftsman. It feels very modern.
It's the classic argument from design. Ibn Rushd says you cannot truly know the artisan God without understanding the art, the universe.
So if the universe is God's creation, then studying how it works, Physics, astronomy, biology, that's the highest form of worship.
Yes. So ignorance isn't piety. Ignorance is an insult.
Right. If you look at a beautiful machine and say, I don't care how it works, you're disrespecting the inventor.
Ibn Rushd says the philosopher, by studying the mechanics of the universe, actually knows God better than the simple believer who just, blindly follows.
That is a powerful reframing, but it leads us right to the core conflict of this deep dive, the double truth. Because, let's be honest, sometimes the art, the universe, it seems to contradict the book, the scripture.
This is where it gets messy. For example, the Quran might speak of God sitting on a throne or having a hand. It implies God has a body.
But logic says what?
Logic, especially the Aristotelian logic that Ibn Rushd loved, proves that God must be infinite and eternal. If God has a body, he's limited. He takes up space. So logic says God cannot have a body.
But scripture says he does. So who wins? Does this lead straight to atheism? Do you just throw out the Quran?
Ibn Rushd says absolutely not. His golden rule is this: truth cannot contradict truth.
Meaning there's only one reality.
Correct. And he argues that if scripture and demonstration, which is his term for absolute logical proof, if they appear to clash, it's not the logic that's wrong, it's our interpretation of the scripture that's wrong.
The scripture must be interpreted allegorically.
That's the one. This is called tawil.
So God's hand isn't a literal hand.
It's a metaphor for power. God's throne isn't a chair. It's a metaphor for majesty. He says God uses these images because he's talking to everyone, not just the geniuses.
Okay, that sounds pretty reasonable to us today. But in the 12th century, that was dynamite.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it implies that the surface meaning of the Quran, the meaning that 99% of people believe, isn't the real truth.
And that brings us to the most controversial part of his work. The part that his critics say is just a recipe for secret atheism.
The hierarchy of minds.
The hierarchy of minds. The idea that not all brains are created equal.
It sounds elitist.
It is elitist, but he saw it as necessary for social stability. He divides humanity into three classes. At the bottom you have the masses, the rhetorical class.
The common people.
Right. He says they're swayed by emotions, poetic stories, and very literal interpretations. They need to imagine a giant king on a throne or they won't understand God at all.
And then in the middle,
the dialecticians, theologians. Ibn Rushd actually can't stand these guys. He says they argue based on opinion and probability and just like to debate and confuse people without proving anything.
And at the top, of course,
the demonstrative class, the philosophers, the elites, the only ones capable of understanding absolute logical proof.
Now, here's the dangerous part that the source points out. Ibn Rushd argues that you must never explain the allegorical truth to the masses.
This is his strict prohibition. He says if you take a common person who only understands things literally and you tell them, hey, God doesn't literally have a hand, that person's mind just can't grasp the abstract concept.
They don't hear God as a transcendent spirit.
No, they hear God doesn't exist. If you take away their mental image, you take away their entire belief.
So revealing the philosophical truth to the masses actually causes them to fall into atheism.
Into kufr, yes. That's his argument.
That's an incredible paradox. To save their faith, you have to lie to them, or at least hide the real truth.
Well, he wouldn't call it lying. He'd call it speaking to their capacity. The source uses this doctor versus the imposter analogy, and it's perfect.
Break that down for us.
So imagine a doctor who is the philosopher. He prescribes a bitter medicine because he knows the biology of the disease, but then an imposter comes along.
Okay.
The imposter tells the patient, this doctor is bad. He's giving you something bitter. I'll give you something sweet. The patient, who doesn't understand medicine, will believe the imposter and die.
And how does that apply to religion?
In religion, the bitter medicine is the law, moral duty. If you tell the common people, hey, the story about hellfire is just a metaphor, you are the imposter. You're telling them the medicine is fake.
So they'll stop behaving morally, they'll lose their fear of God, and their souls will die.
That's the idea. So the philosopher's duty is to keep the secret. Let the masses believe the literal story, even though the philosopher knows it's an allegory.
It creates a double standard, a double truth. One for the smart people, one for the regular people.
And you can see why Al-Ghazali and the religious authorities hated this. It sounds like the philosophers are just pretending to be Muslims while secretly believing in some cold, abstract Greek god.
Yeah, it sounds like they're crossing their fingers behind their backs while they pray.
To an extent, yes. And that suspicion is why Al-Ghazali attacked them on those specific heresies we mentioned earlier, like the eternity of the world.
Right. Al-Ghazali says, God created the world out of nothing. Boom, a specific moment in time. But the philosopher said the universe is eternal.
Which just sounds like atheism. If the world was always here, you don't need a creator, right?
So how does Ibn Rushd talk his way out of that one?
He says it's pure semantics. It's just a fight over words. He
Mm.
says, look, we both agree God is the creator. We both agree the world depends on God. The only difference is time.
So you say God created it at a moment. I say God has been creating it forever.
He uses the foot in the sand analogy. If a foot has been standing in the sand for eternity, the footprint has also been there for eternity.
But the foot still causes the footprint.
Exactly. The footprint is still dependent on the foot. He says the universe is the footprint, God is the foot. Just because they both exist forever doesn't mean God isn't the boss.
He's trying so hard to bridge these gaps. He does the same thing with God's knowledge. The accusation was that philosophers believe God doesn't know particulars, that he doesn't know you.
Which just destroys prayer. I mean, if God is just some cosmic force who doesn't know my name, why would I pray to him?
Exactly. What's the point?
Ibn Rushd's defense is that God does know you, but his knowledge is eternal knowledge. It's a completely different category from our knowledge. Our knowledge is reactive. I know you're there because I see you.
And God's knowledge
Is causative. He knows you because he wills you to exist. So accusing him of atheism here is just a misunderstanding of terms.
He's basically saying, stop trying to drag God down to your human level. My God is bigger than your God.
Precisely. My God is so big he doesn't need eyes to see or ears to hear. But of course, to the average person, a God without eyes or ears, that sounds like nothing at all.
And that's the tragedy, isn't it? He tried to save religion by making it rational. But in doing that, he made it unrecognizable to the average believer.
And looking at the commentary by Hughes and Portugal in our source, it really seems like history made a choice.
It did. The source discusses the historical verdict. It compares the Islamic world to the West. The West eventually discovered Ibn Rushd. They translated him. They called him the commentator.
And his ideas helped spark the Renaissance. The West embraced that struggle between faith and reason. They let the collision happen.
But the source argues the Islamic world, specifically the Ottoman Empire later on, sided with Al-Ghazali.
They chose safety. They chose stability. Portugal points to a specific moment with Sultan Mehmed II Fatih the Conqueror. A brilliant man, but when he organized the madrasas, the schools, he chose the curriculum of Al-Ghazali over the philosophy of Ibn Rushd.
And the consequence of that choice.
Stagnation. The source argues this prevented the rise of an independent intellectual class. There was no civil society of thinkers who could challenge the state or the mosque. The ulema became state employees.
And religion became an ideology to control the raya, the flock.
It's a harsh critique, but that's the argument. By suppressing the dangerous questions, they also suppress the answers that lead to progress.
The source compares it to the Catholic Church, which is interesting. The church persecuted thinkers. Sure, we all know about Galileo.
Right.
But the source argues that in the West, the church, the state, and the universities were in a constant power struggle. That friction created heat, and that heat created light.
Whereas in the post-Ghazali system, there was a unified front. The message was, don't ask questions that might lead to atheism.
It became a closed society. Fear of atheism led to a fear of thinking.
Right. If you start asking about the wind, you might end up questioning God, so better not to ask about the wind at all.
And if you don't ask about the wind, you never invent meteorology.
Exactly. You stay safe, but you stay stuck.
It really is a tragedy. Ibn Rushd tried to build a system where the elite could explore the universe without breaking the faith of the masses, but the system decided it was just too risky.
It's the tragedy of the double truth. He wanted to protect the masses from atheism, but in the end, the culture protected itself from him.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this image of Ibn Rushd, the judge who loved logic, just watching his books burn.
It's a powerful image. He truly believed truth cannot contradict truth. He believed that if you look deep enough into science, you find God at the bottom.
But the world wasn't ready to look that deep.
Or maybe they were afraid of what they might find. Or not find.
It leaves us with a lot to chew on. But here's the thought I want to leave you with, coming out of all this tension in the source material.
Okay.
We often hear that faith is fragile, right? That it needs to be protected from science, from skepticism, from thinking too much.
But if your faith requires you to ban questions just to survive,
Yeah,
is it really faith? Or is it just compliance?
that's the question.
And if Ibn Rushd was right, if truth really cannot contradict truth, then why are we still so afraid that thinking too deeply will kill God? Maybe the thing that dies isn't God. Maybe the only thing that dies is our small, limited human understanding of him. And maybe that's a death worth having.
A provocative thought to end on. Reason, revelation, and the courage to use your mind. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you on the next deep dive.